Good day to you all. I would like to welcome you to this beautiful presentation. The topic for today is going to be the art of defense, the father figure archetype. So, in today's presentation, we're going to look at some psychological techniques which are used by social manipulators and abusers in covert and overt situations. So, what we're going to be doing is basically just trying to debunk or expose abusers' techniques, whether it is in a social context, a religious context, or a psychological family context. We're going to look at the abuser's playbook. We're going to debunk the abuser's playbook, and I am basically going to give you the grammar, the knowledge that you need in order to be able to defend yourself, to protect yourself. Hence the topic, the art of self-defense. So the father figure archetype in psychology is basically the archetype of self-protection. We have the sacred masculine and we have the sacred feminine. So the sacred masculine, unfortunately, in contemporary society, has been thrown under the bus and it is being seen. Now, let us look at the aims of this presentation today. Today, we're going to look at the following aims. The aims are to equip the learner with techniques that will help them self-protect themselves against overt and covert psychological and emotional abuses. The next one is to debunk the neo-feministic agenda in contemporary society by shedding light on it, to equip the listener and the learner with the knowledge and the grammar needed to thrive in a neo-feministic society. And lastly, to spread awareness on overt and covert abuse in contemporary society by sharing the abuser's playbook in order to create solutions to counter and to self-protect as well. Now, let us look at the next slide, which is all about human rights. So this is just the preview, which I've talked about. Basically, we're going to look at three different things. We're going to look at the abuser's playbook, which is going to be debunked. And we're going to look at the fawn response and the techniques which abusers use in order to socially manipulate victims or individuals who are in ignorance of such knowledge. So this is basically meant to equip you with the abuser's playbook so that when it is being used against you, you'll be able to know what's going on. And then lastly, I'll give you the solutions which you can use to thrive in such a society. Now, let us look at some basic human rights. I'm going to start with a quote that says, "If one does not know their human rights, how will they know that they've been taken away? They cannot, because they do not basically know the basic human rights." So, unfortunately, in our society, we have people who think they know their human rights, and that's the problem. They think they know. They think they know their human rights, but when you ask them in person, they'll fumble around in their brains trying to even state what a human right is. So here I'm going to tell you the basic human rights that you have. Number one, you have the right to liberty and security. You have the right for respect for private and family life. You have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. You have the right to freedom of expression, the right to protection of property. You have the right to no discrimination, the right to education, and of course, the right to a fair trial. So these are just basic human rights. Now, if you look at the slide on the right, the picture on the right, you see that there's a common word that is highlighted in blue, and that word is no. In the occult science, they call the word no the lost word. It is a lost word because most people are unable to say no because they fear the consequences. But you don't have to fear the consequences when it is your right to say no. So, no is a lost word. It is imperative to get familiar with the word no. The word no is a boundary that protects one from covert and overt abuses and manipulators. If one does not know their human rights, they become easy prey. It's very important to understand the lost word, no. Now, let us look at some techniques that all of these covert and overt abusers or manipulators like to use. By looking at the problem, Just like any academic student, you look at the problem first and then you look at the solutions. So this is the trivium method of truth discovery. I am going to start with the knowledge, the grammar, and then it is your duty to understand it and take the rightful actions from that knowledge. So in psychology, we have something that is known as a fawn response. I am not going to talk about the first three trauma responses. I'm going to look at the fawn response in order to articulate the presentation. So the psychologist Pete Walker coined the term fawn, meaning pleasing the threat in order to avoid conflict. So the term fawn in psychology, in brief, just means people pleasing. Now, most people please and they assume that it is a virtue. But psychology is telling us that fawning is actually a codependent trauma response. It is a wound that needs to be healed. People pleasing is not a virtue, it is a codependent trauma response. In fact, people pleasing happens when one has a lack of identity. And the identity I'm talking about is not a social role. For example, social roles like being a farmer, being a psychologist, being a teacher, being an engineer. These are social identities. But the lack of identity I am trying to discuss here is the lack of the core self, the self which is basic consciousness, basic awareness, basic serene awareness that all of us have from a very young age. So if you look at the slide, you see that there are only four types. But here we are discussing the fourth specific type. So this is not a virtue. People pleasing is not a virtue, but it is a codependent trauma response. It makes it easier for an individual to be enslaved and to be manipulated because that's exactly what the abusers would want. They want individuals who are able to people please, people who are not entirely connected to their sense of self. So they are lacking an identity. Therefore, they seek to have an identity in people pleasing. But psychology is saying that this is a fawn response. It is a lack of identity. It is when someone has no boundaries, so they begin to assume that people pleasing is a virtue, when in fact it is a codependent trauma response. Now, let us look at some techniques which are used by covert and overt abusers. Now, the first one here is isolation. Isolation is the first technique of the covert abusers. It allows for the other following techniques to be slowly implanted and grow by not allowing the victim to be exposed to truth or opposing information. So, in other words, I'll give you an example. Back in the days, we had the slave trade, where we had overt slavery. That is to say, individuals would be overtly isolated physically from their tribes, from their families, etc. Nowadays, we have covert isolation. So this is isolation in our own heads, isolation within our own bubbles, in our own minds. This cuts people off from alternative forms of information. So information or knowledge outside the mainstream narrative is the solution to counter this covert and overt tactic. For example, if one is socially isolated or psychologically isolated rather, they are unable to reach out to alternative forms of information which can then break that isolation and bring them the information, the right information and right truth which they actually need in order to progress in the evolution of their own consciousness. So the right knowledge is capable of deprogramming and empowering the targeted victims. Isolation plays on feelings of guilt, shame, and helplessness, making the individual easy prey to control. So this is one of the techniques which is used by social manipulators. These social manipulators can be religious, can be co-workers, can be your husband, your spouse, your wife. It doesn't matter. They all think the same because they're all using the same playbook. which we're going to debunk slowly as we go on in this presentation. The next technique, which is often commonly used, is gaslighting. Now, what is gaslighting? Gaslighting is an insidious form of manipulation and psychological control. Victims of gaslighting are deliberately and systematically fed false information that leads them to question what they know to be true, often about themselves. They may end up doubting their memory. They may end up doubting their perceptions. And over time, a gaslighter's manipulations can grow more complex and potent, making it increasingly difficult for the victim to see the truth. So, in other words, gaslighting is basically feeding someone information that is false, that will make them feel like they are the problem, or that will make them feel like they're going crazy. That's basic gaslighting. So what this does is the individual or the victim who is under this kind of social manipulation seeks the information from the abuser, because the abuser is the one who is planting the doubts in the individual's mind. So you can think of it as a husband who might try to gaslight his wife into making her think that she's crazy just because she sees through his abusive tactics, or just because she or he sees through the techniques or the covert techniques that are being used against him or her. The next technique we want to discuss is what is known in psychology as a shared fantasy. Now, what is a shared fantasy? This is a pretend make-believe narrative that allows the abuser to hook their claws into the victim. It works through hypnotic suggestions that are covertly embedded into the subconscious mind through linguistic and visual programming. So a shared fantasy, basically, as you can read what I just wrote here, it is an insidious form or a make-believe pretend narrative that allows for the abuser to hook their claws into the victim. So it can either range from romantic shared fantasies, spiritual shared fantasies, or even different kinds of shared fantasies. But usually it comes in these two forms: romance and religion. It can be disguised as a romantic or religious fantasy that allows the abuser to maintain prolonged contact with the victim or victims. So, for example, you might have a shared fantasy in a relationship whereby the abuser is constantly feeding the victim a fantasy, a narrative which in reality really is not true, but is just meant to keep the victim under control, to keep the victim under hypnosis, so that maybe the abuser can gain money from the victim. So it can be a romantic shared fantasy where the woman is constantly trying to get money from the guy, so she constantly gives him these messages of love, affection, all these kinds of fantasies which are not really real but are a covert tactic that is meant to hook into the guy's wallet, hook into the guy's attention, or hook into the guy's basic daily life. The innate desire for love or spiritual connection is exploited within the individual. It also works through sexual bonding and spiritual lies that are enforced through dogmas and false interpretations. So, shared fantasies can also come in a religious context where you have the abuser or the manipulator, social manipulator, telling his members in a church, in a congregation, that he has direct connection to God, and in order for you to get to God, you have to go through him or her. This is a shared fantasy. This is literally social manipulation. If you look on the right, you can see the picture where you have the abuser literally dumping his ideas into the victim's brain so that the victim starts to think like the abuser. And this is exactly what the social manipulators intend to do, to have their victims think the same way that they do, so that they keep their claws or their invisible covert leashes hooked into their victims, which is why people keep on recycling the same abusive experiences. It is not because there is some devil out there that hates you, but it is because your brain has been programmed to think like the abuser. So literally, the enemy is now within the mind. The enemy is in the mind because he or she has implanted their thoughts, their ideas, their fantasies, their ideologies into the victim's brain so that the victim constantly seeks or constantly recycles the same experiences and finds themselves in the same situation all the time. So it is a devilish tactic disguised as an angel of light. This is what we call a shared fantasy. Let us go on to the next technique, which is what we call controlling the narrative. Now, what is the most important thing for all social manipulators, for all abusers? What is it that matters to the most? What is it that matters to the most? If you can understand what matters to the most, you'll be able to tell the difference between love and abuse. And the difference is this: the most important thing for the abusers, whether it's covert or overt, is control. Control. So the covert abusers always have to hold the pen that writes the story of their victim. For example, they use labeling theory to label individuals and truth tellers as either crazy or conspiracy theorists or as simple as know-nothing primitives. This removes alternative narratives from the mainstream narrative, which the abuser seeks to control at all times. For example, you might have a husband who's trying to keep his wife under a leash so that he continues to emotionally or psychologically abuse her. So, what he or she might try to do is to control the narrative, how other people see the victim. So, in order to disregard the victim's opinions, the victim might be labeled as crazy, or the victim might be labeled as a know nothing person. So this disregards everything that they say. So other people, when they see the victim, they won't actually be listening to what the victim is saying, but they'll actually just be seeing that label, that narrative that has been branded on them either by society or by the people close to them, which in most cases are the control freaks, which we are talking about here today. So, in other words, they seek to control how other people view the victim or victims in order to socially ostracize them and, of course, isolate them. So, if one finds themselves in such a situation, whether it's in a romantic relationship, whether it's in a religious context, or at work, the solution is to speak one's truth more louder and more clearer in a logical and reasonable way. The solution is a fair linguistic debate in order to take the power back from the abusers. So basically, taking a hold of the pen, taking the power back, taking the pen away from the abusers, and writing a different narrative is the solution. Because all abusers, like I mentioned, um, love one thing the most, and that is control. So silence, when this technique is being used, is not as effective because silence only makes them hold the pen more stronger. They're able to write the narrative. So if you get the pen back, you write the story, you create the narrative, you bring the game to them using their own techniques. The next technique which we want to discuss is what is known in psychology as trauma bonding. So a trauma bond is a connection between an abusive person and the individual they abuse. It typically occurs when the abused person begins to develop sympathy or affection for the abuser. It works through love bombing and devaluation, which creates a love and hate cycle that binds the victim to the abuser. by using heightened emotion followed by intense lows that create a craving for the next high from the abuser. Let me try and simplify that. So, in other words, we're saying that a trauma bond is a cycle, an emotional or physical cycle, in which the abuser firstly gives the victim so much attention, so much love, so much affection, to the point that the victim feels loved, seen, and they feel like they're the center of the world, the center of attraction. But social manipulators always do things in a deliberate fashion. So this is just a cycle. It's the first phase of the trauma bond. The next phase, which then follows, is what we call devaluation in psychology, which means that the love is taken away slowly and abandonment is then created. So the victim is now triggered into a fear of abandonment. And once that happens, they're going to seek the first feeling that they had when they met the abuser, which is the love, the affection, because it's now gone. So just like any drug addict, they then develop what is known as codependency or dependency, where they now go into this vicious cycle of looking for that love, which is now being withheld by the abuser in order for the victim to keep on coming back for that high. So the victim develops positive feelings for their captors. So the covert manipulation works like this. The victim starts to develop positive feelings for their captors. These captors can be covert, that is hidden, occult, or they can be overt, in the open. Can be in a relationship, in a religious context, or in a work situation. A person may develop because they rely on the abuser to fulfill their emotional needs. So remember, codependency is actually a wound that needs to be healed because it can lead to one being easily susceptible to such techniques such as trauma bonding, because one starts to want to fulfill their emotional needs using their partner or partners, using their religious leader or leaders, or basically using their friends. But if those individuals are abusers or social manipulators, they will be able to take advantage and trauma bond the victim back into the abusive cycle. So a person may begin to associate love with abuse. What is the difference? What is the difference between love and abuse? Love does not seek to control. It's very important for people in academic and psychological endeavors to understand that love does not seek to control. Control is for control freaks, but love does not do that. So if you want to tell the difference, always just analyze using your own logic whether you're in a situation where the partner, romantic partner, or religious leader or co-worker is trying to control you emotionally or psychologically, or they actually do love you. The next technique is, of course, what we call love bombing. The term love bombing refers to a pattern of overly affectionate behavior that typically occurs at the beginning of a relationship, often a romantic one in which one party bombs the other with over-the-top displays of adoration and attention. So this is part of the trauma bond, love bombing. Love bombing disables the victim's guard by exploiting the natural human desire for love and attention. So most human beings growing up as children, they have the natural innate desire to be seen, to be loved, and to have attention. For example, a child that cries out to their parents is looking for attention. They want to be held. They want to be taken care of. So as individuals grow up, these innate desires don't go away. They just become embedded in the subconscious, and social manipulators, overt or covert, are able to then exploit these subconscious innate desires in order to gain control over their victims. So, in an abusive cycle, it is usually followed by devaluation and abandonment, which creates a trauma bond, forcing the victim into learned helplessness. So, learned helplessness is basically when the victim starts to feel that they can't cope without their abuser. They want their emotional needs fulfilled by the same person that has been abusing them, whether it's emotional or psychological. So, love bombing is a deliberate and manipulative tactic that creates emotional dependency on the abuser. So, that's one of the techniques that individuals should watch out for in order to learn the art of self defense. Enmeshment. So, enmeshment is a psychological term that for a relationship pattern where personal boundaries are blurred and individuals lose their sense of self. This is enmeshment. So, it is basically where boundaries are breached by an energy overload to such a point that the victim loses their own sense of self. They're unable to tell where they end and where the abuser begins. This is not healthy. This is not a sign of mental health. This is a sign of um, it's a disorder. It is whereby the identity becomes so overloaded, the boundaries are breached to the point that the victim feels lost. So, usually, this happens in families. Enmeshed family members may struggle to develop and maintain a sense of individuality. They may have difficulty distinguishing their own thoughts, their own feelings, and identities from those of other family members. So, this is enmeshment. It is important for um, individuals to develop a healthy mental mindset by rediscovering their boundaries. So if you look on the right, we have this slide, this picture, where the first step is the boundaries are breached. There's an energy overload. This can be in a gang, people who associate themselves with drug gangs. They might start calling themselves a particular name, and all the individuals start to think the same, they start to act the same, which means there's no longer any sense of individuality, but it's now a group think, which is very dangerous because it can hinder one's autonomous development and life goals. If one wants to become something better, like a lawyer, a psychologist, or something, or someone that can help other people, it's impossible to do this if one is enmeshed in dangerous spiritual organizations or dangerous family situations or even dangerous gangs. So the next step then is to rediscover the boundaries and then create a stronger sense of self, a sense of self that is coming from within and is not dependent on external people or external circumstances. And then, of course, you want to be able to let people back in while respecting the boundaries in order not to be isolated. So we need to be in the social context, but at the same time, we are being in the group. We are maintaining that sense of individual self. It's very important to get those two dynamics balanced. Now, let us look at some solutions that we can use in order to maintain a healthy sense of self, at the same time, in order to understand the art of self defense. Solution number one is knowledge. Now, the term knowledge comes from the word gnosis, or in Greek, kenosis, which can directly be translated in English as diagnosis. To diagnose something is to dissect it so that you look at it, experience it, and understand it for yourself, and you get personal gnosis. So, according to the trivium process of truth discovery, knowledge or grammar is the first step before understanding and action. So, if you look on the right, we have a picture. This guy over here with the briefcase is representing knowledge. So, he comes, or he or she comes with the knowledge. He is the tech, opens the settings in the brain, lights the light bulb on so that we have the light to see. The grammar is the light. Knowledge is a kind of light that allows for a person to see that which was occult, that which was hidden. In other words, that which was occulted, so that you begin to see the truth of the matter, the facts. Because this knowledge is not new. There is nothing new under the sun, as that ancient maxim goes. So this is not new knowledge, but it can be new for other people who are still trapped in these abusive cycles and they don't know how to get out of them because they lack, again, the knowledge. So this presentation is an example of shared knowledge that seeks to shed light on this particular topic. By knowing the dynamics at play, one is able to defend themselves against harmful psychological attacks before they occur or during their occurrence. So as the saying goes, knowledge is power. Continuous learning is key. So one has to continuously learn. Do not be isolated in a bubble, because that is how the social manipulators are easily going to get to control, enslave, and basically run you into the ground without your awareness. The second solution here is a term which is known in psychology as gray rock, the gray rock method. Now, this is a tactic people may use to deal with abusive or manipulative behavior. It involves becoming as uninteresting and unengaged as possible so that the other person loses interest. Gray rocking includes using silence as a boundary. Now, conscious silence can be used as a boundary. I'm going to quote Leonardo da Vinci, who said that nothing commands authority more than silence. This is Leonardo da Vinci who came up with that quote. And it is true, because silence is a divine sacred gift which each and every one of us possesses. Hence, it goes back all the way to our human rights of being able to say no. So silence is a sacred way of saying no. It commands authority. Each and every individual has the right to this divine gift of conscious silence. So, it is a sacred power and gift that should be exercised consciously against the covert and overt abuses. The gray rock method is used to reduce emotional harm from manipulators and abusers. So let us look at the sub-dynamics of the gray rock method when interacting with toxic or manipulative people. Number one, avoiding eye contact. It's always a way that you can always use to gray rock, because there's no rule or law that says that you must maintain eye contact with anyone that you don't want to. And then you can be boring or non-stimulating. Unfortunately, most people want to be exciting. They want to be people-pleasing. But like we mentioned, this is a trauma response. It's fawning. And one needs to be aware of their own self and emotional mood and catch yourself when you're fawning, when you're people-pleasing, and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I people-pleasing? What am I trying to do? Am I just trying to please the threat? If you are, then you should know that the person you're people-pleasing, there's a high chance that they might be a social manipulator, because healthy people don't look for that from other people. So not getting emotional is another way of gray rocking. That means you're aware of your mood, you're aware of your emotions, you feel them when they come up, but you don't react. Leaving the room. This is one of my favorites. You're not bound to be in a room that you don't want to be, unless if it's for work purposes. But the point is, there's always that option. Not bringing up a new conversation. Brief responses. You give a brief response, you respond, but you don't react. So one needs to know the difference between responding and reacting. You need to respond, not react. Not in your head or shrugging your shoulders. So this is the gray rock method. Have fun with it, learn it, understand it, use it. The last solution here is defiant self-care. Defiant self-care. So defiant self-care refers to taking care of oneself regardless of what external sources say. It is physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual self-care. While many people may view self-care as a form of selfish indulgence, the act of caring for oneself is an important part of a person's overall well-being. We cannot take care of others if we do not take care of ourselves first. So defining self-care is very important. It can also be used as a boundary against abusers and manipulators. Taking care of yourself emotionally, physically, socially, spiritually, it's very important. If you adopt the right techniques to care for yourself, you will be able to reap the benefits, such as better physical and mental health. So, if we look on the right, we have physical self care, sleep, stretching, walking, physical release, healthy food, yoga, rest. We have emotional self care, stress management, emotional maturity, forgiveness, compassion, and kindness. We have social self care, which is what we're discussing here, boundaries, support systems like this channel, communication, spending time together with people you love and people who truly care for you, as well as asking for help. And then spiritual self care, very important. You need to spend some time alone, meditation, yoga, prayer, connection, and journaling. All these are forms of self care. So, self care is equals to responsibility. There is no freedom without personal responsibility. Freedom and personal responsibility are two sides of the same coin. So, this includes nutrition, hygiene, exercise, meditation, praying, listening to inspirational music to give you an improved quality of life. I hope this was helpful and I hope that it made some sense. This presentation was basically teaching you the art of self-defense, which is very important for each and every individual who exists in a social context, religious, work, family, or otherwise. Very important to learn the art of self-defense. Now you might be asking me, what am I defending? The sacred masculine is the art of self-defense, and the sacred masculine defends the sacred feminine, which is all about care, nurturing, as well as um, spending some time alone, staying at home, forgiving yourself. This is the sacred feminine. But the sacred feminine cannot stand if the sacred masculine does not know how to defend it. So the sacred masculine, the father figure archetype, should be activated in order to take care of the sacred feminine. With that being said, we have come to the end of our presentation. I hope this was helpful. If you want, you can always just look at the techniques over and over again until they sink in, so that you become an unstoppable social engineer who is immune to covert and overt slavery. Take care, stay peaceful, and remember, stay mindful.